This is Thomas Wayne Riley, and you have found yourself in the American Southwest. Mangas Coloradas. Doubtless the worst Indian within our boundaries, and one who has been the cause of more murder and torturing and burning at the stake in this country than all together, has been killed. Quote from Brigadier General James Carleton to Union Army superiors in Washington, D.C. on January 1863. Only an hour after the execution of Mangas Coloradas by Brigadier General West's men, 2 patrols were sent out by West, with one heading towards Pinos Altos and the other heading south. They both were to engage and kill any Apache that they met on the road before the Mimbres Apache could find out their chief was dead. Later that day, Mangas Coloradas' own people approached the mining town of Pinos Altos peacefully. They were ignorant that their chief had died, and they were fired upon by West's men. 11 Apache were killed, and 1 was wounded. Included in those sent to the happy place were Mangas's wife and 1 of his sons. The other troop of soldiers sent by West were led by Captain Sherland, who found a group of Chihenne Apache at a place Sherland described as being, quote, the most rugged, high, and difficult mountains to ascend and pass I ever saw, end quote. His 50 cavalrymen would kill 9 and wound many of these Apaches who were of Victorio's band. And we'll have more on Victorio in the next episode. Both of these Union patrols brought back plenty of Apache scalps. The war since the cutting of the tent had now taken off, and for the next few decades, death, fire, fear, and destruction would rain down upon the Indian and non-Indian residents of the American Southwest alike. Noted Apache historian Dan Thrapp would tell author Edwin Sweeney, who wrote Mangas Coloradas, the book I heavily used last time. Dan Thrapp would tell author Edwin Sweeney that, quote, the greatest tragedy of the affair, he means the cowardly killing of Mangas, the greatest tragedy of the affair was less the death of the aging chieftain than the lasting distrust generated on the part of the Apaches toward white Americans and soldiers. End quote. Shortly after the murder of Mangas and the raids on his people by the Americans, Cochise, Victorio, and a Bedonkohe chief named Lewis, who was probably one of Mangas's many sons, they all got together and formed a large war party and retaliated all over the Southwest. One of these places was on the Rio Grande, a place known as San Diego Crossing. On June 17th, they would fight a short battle, the Apache, and they would kill 2 Americans. One of those killed was the commanding officer, a Lieutenant Bargy. After his death, he was found scalped, his head was cut off, his chest had been cut open, and his heart had been removed. Some say it was eaten. In this episode, we will go over yet another disappointing and horrific incident that will sow even more distrust among the Apache towards the White Eyes, and even further inflame the violence between the two groups in the American Southwest. Even before the cutting of the tent and the death of Mangas, the Apache, from the east, the Mescalero, to the Chiricahua, to the western Apache, they all had their moments of violence and raiding. Whenever food got scarce or they needed to seek vengeance, there was a raid. In Edwin Sweeney's Mangas Coloradas, he had a great quote about the situation in Arizona in 1861. He wrote, "In 1861, Arizona entrepreneur Sylvester Maury would declare that he would accept help from any source, including the devil himself, if it meant an ally against the Apaches, who he compared to rattlesnakes." End quote. Things weren't about to get easier for the settlers of the region, though. The whole cutting of the tent with Cochise and Mangas and the White Eyes, it was all on account of the kidnapping of the one-eyed, red-haired boy named Felix from southern Arizona. Felix does eventually take the name Mickey Free, not to confuse you. We know from the last episode that Cochise and the Chiricahua Apache did not in fact have the boy, but instead the western Apaches, particularly a once Mexican, also one-eyed western Apache named Beto, had taken him. After the kidnapping, Beto took the boy and the stolen cattle that was causing quite the squabble at Apache Pass. Beto took the boy and the loot to an Apache man, his chief, named Esquiminzin in Aravaipa Canyon. Aravaipa Canyon is a place subscribers know well because it is where the Apache Kid was from. It is southeast of Globe, Arizona, and just pretty much straight east of Tucson and Phoenix. Once in Esquiminzin's valley, Beto traded or sold, or just kind of gave away, the boy to the western Apache chief, who for some reason did not kill him. It was probably his one eye and his red hair. Red hair was seen as something different amongst the Apaches. It could also have been that the once Mexican Beto said, "Hey, look at me. He could one day be a good raider just like me." No one knows why the Apaches spared Felix, aka Mickey Free. We'll get into that later, though. Esquiminzin, long before this, he had married the daughter of a chief named Santos. But eventually, Esquiminzin, or there are many ways that he is spelled in many of the books, Hashkibanzin, Esquiminzin, his name means angry. Men stand in line for him. Well, he became chief of 150 Apaches in this beautiful Aravaipa Canyon, and he was known as a fierce warrior. And now, he owned the boy Felix. The people of the small Apache group called Felix a Nakaye, which meant a captured Mexican. The boy was probably half Mexican, so it fit. Felix was never accepted among these western Apaches. He was also never despised either. And over time, he learned the Apache ways and language, and he became valuable enough to stay alive. Now, I said he wasn't despised among these western Apaches. Among the Chiricahua, he was hated for decades. He was the, quote, coyote whose kidnapping had brought war to the Chiricahua, end quote. And yeah, that is pretty true. That's a pretty accurate description of Felix, a.k.a. Mickey Free. For subscribers who are familiar with the man I'm about to mention, only about a month after Felix, a.k.a. Mickey Free, was kidnapped and brought to Esquiminzin, only about a month after that, the Apache Kid was born to Toga de Chuz. And Toga de Chuz was one of these many western Apache that were led by Esquiminzin. And these Apache would soon be at a place known as Camp Grant near Fort Grant, where over 150 Apache brothers and sisters would be massacred in their sleep. The entire end of the last episode, it was dedicated to the beginning of the war of Cochise and Mangas against the White Eyes. But it is worth mentioning that because of their righteous reign of terror, Johnny Ward, stepfather of Mickey Free, he moved his family to Tucson. Now, in one of the books I read, David Roberts' book over the Apache, he gives a pretty grim description of Johnny Ward. But I guess it's not too important for our story. So Johnny Ward moves his family near Tucson. The other large town in southern Arizona, Tubac, was completely abandoned. Not forever, mind you, but around this time in the early 1860s. According to author and historian Paul Andrew Hutton in his The Apache Wars, he says, quote, "Most of the Mexican mine and ranch workers fled south to Sonora. The remaining settlers at Canoa were slaughtered by the Apaches in late July. To make matters worse, a large party of Mexican bandits came north to loot the abandoned mines and ranches." End quote. In other words, this place was not doing well at the time. Tubac abandoned, Tucson surrounded, mines abandoned, ranches left. This town of Canoa is on I-19 between Tucson and the Mexican border. It is north of Tubac. Less than 60 Americans were still in Tucson in August of 1861. And every farm and all but one mine were abandoned, like I said. Both Cochise and Mangas, they believed this abandonment was their doing. And part of it certainly was. But later, Cochise would tell an American official, quote, "We were successful, and your soldiers were driven away, and your people killed, and we again possessed our land." End quote. It was to be a brief victory, though. Meanwhile, over to the east, in 1862, with the Mescalero Apaches, they were being hunted by the Union California forces who were under Carleton. And they had their orders from Carleton to kill every Mescalero, quote, "whenever and wherever you can find them." End quote. One of these companies that were on the hunt was led by podcast alumni Kit Carson. I may never have to do an episode on Kit Carson. I'm going to talk about him so often with other people in other incidences. But Carson was at the head of 150 or so, mostly Hispanic, mostly illiterate men. They were fighting first the Rebs, and then the Reds, the Apaches to be precise, but specifically the Mescaleros over at the Sacramento Mountains. Another company was led by an Irishman named James Paddy Graydon. He was known by his own men as a swashbuckling, reckless daredevil. But actually, his outfit had the least desertions in the territory and some of the lowest desertions in the whole Civil War. His men loved him. He and his men of Company H were also pursuing the Mescaleros in the Sierra Blanca region of the Sacramento Mountains. In particular, Graydon was after a man named Chief Manuelito. And he would find the chief at a place known as Gallina Springs, and that is east of the Salinas Missions and north of the Sacramento Mountains in New Mexico. After he and his men ran into the chief, Manuelito asked the Union officer for some tobacco. Hutton describes in Apache Wars what happened next. Quote, "Graydon intercepted Manuelito's band and made peace signs, and as the Mescaleros approached, he ordered his men to be ready to fire. Manuelito walked up to Graydon, saying he was on his way to Santa Fe to meet with Carleton, and asked for some tobacco. Graydon responded by sending a shotgun blast into his head at point-blank range. All the soldiers opened fire. 11 warriors and an old woman were killed." End quote. This became known by Graydon's superiors and historians as the Gallinas Massacre. I did read a different account from a man who was actually there at the massacre, and he said that Manuelito asked for whiskey and grabbed his pistol, to which Graydon apparently shouted in his Irish brogue, "Fight be it!" And then he emptied the shotgun barrel into Manuelito's head. Either way, it was a slaughter and a bloodbath. Afterwards, Graydon distributed 17 horses to his men as loot, Apache horses. Although these Apache horses were later confiscated by the Federals, Carson was actually ordered by Carleton to return these horses to the Mescaleros themselves as a kind of sign of peace, maybe an apology. Graydon and another man would not long after this incident die in an old-fashioned Wild West duel at the famed Fort Stanton. And I'm going to tell that story. It's a tangent, but it is a good story. Although the outcome, well, they both die. Dr. John Marmaduke Whitlock was a Kentuckian, and he was a surgeon at the time of the Civil War. He also supplied the army with a bunch of stuff like lumber and beef. He owned one of the largest ranches in New Mexico and a bunch of sawmills. He was a well-known and well-to-do man about New Mexico. But Graydon, he didn't much care for him, and he called him a, quote, pimp who follows the army, end quote. Whitlock, though, he wasn't really enjoying his time in the army. He had just signed up when the war started. He'd already been out of the army for some time. But when the war started, he signed up. But the whole time he was being subordinated by junior and less competent surgeons. Eventually, though, he was put out in the field, and his first taste of surgeon battle, or mending the troops, was at the Battle of Val Verde, which the Confederates won. Eventually, Carleton came in and whipped out the Confederates and put Whitlock under the charge of Graydon, under Graydon's command. Now, Graydon, he was an Irishman, he was Catholic, and he was a hard drinker. He actually used to own a saloon in Arizona. Whitlock, on the other hand, he was a Protestant from the States. He was not an immigrant. He did not drink. And they were quite the two opposite men. A lot of this I got from Whitlock's great-great-great-granddaughter, who wrote about this incident in 2003 for the Southeastern New Mexico Historical Society. So, Whitlock got placed at Fort Stanton with Carson and Graydon, where Whitlock heard of Graydon's massacre of Manuelito at Galena Springs, and apparently Whitlock did not like what Graydon did to those Apaches. So he kind of let that be known, started bad-mouthing Graydon. Graydon found out, and the two exchanged some words, literal words, and then some notes. They were trading notes back and forth through the fort. They were playing cards, they were at work, it's kind of silly, but one morning, Graydon approached Whitlock and told him to leave the fort and never come back, and if he ever talked bad about him, Graydon would horsewhip the good doctor. So I'm actually, for the good last bit of this story, I'm going to quote a newspaper article from the St. Louis Globe-Democrat, which wrote about this incident just a few weeks after it happened. The article reads, quote, "During this time, Dr. W. was smiling and said, 'Captain, you are in the wrong.' The doctor smiled as he perused it being the note, when Graydon cried, 'Doctor, if you insult me again in that way, I'll horsewhip you.' On hearing this, the doctor placed his hand on his pistol also, and both drew them at the same instant. But Graydon commenced retreating, crying out as he did so, 'He is going to murder me! He is going to murder me!' The doctor remained motionless, holding his fire, and contenting himself by saying loudly, 'Look at the coward! See how he runs!' When this taunt reached his ears, Graydon sprang behind a carriage he was passing and commenced firing at the doctor with a heavy dragoon revolver, to which the doctor replied with a light 5-shooter. Graydon emptied one revolver and then drew another, firing it as fast as possible. One of Graydon's shots had taken effect in the doctor's wrist, without breaking the bone, and had also inflicted a flesh wound in his side. Another of his shots had glanced on a standard of the carriage and wounded a mule. The doctor had only been able to fire 3 shots, as Graydon's person was only partially exposed, and 2 charged had failed fire. His last shot, however, had struck Graydon in the breast, causing him to cry out, 'Oh, he has murdered me! He has murdered me!' The doctor, on finding himself defenseless, while his antagonist still held a loaded pistol in his hand, walked rapidly towards the sutler's store, which was about 100 yards distant, while Graydon, after standing a few moments by the carriage, began to sink and was conveyed to his tent. End quote. I mean, that is one heck of a vivid Wild West story. After the shootout, Graydon was carried to his tent, and Whitlock bandaged his hand as best as he could. It was still bleeding everywhere. And then he grabbed a shotgun. He intended on finishing the job. I'll quote again from the great detailed article from the St. Louis Globe-Democrat. Quote, on Graydon's crying out that he was murdered, his first lieutenant, Morris, said to his company, "Your captain has been murdered. Let us avenge his death." And away they went like a pack of bloodhounds for the sutler's store, which they reached just as the doctor came out with the gun in his hand. As soon as Lieutenant Morris saw him, he cried out, "That's the scoundrel! Kill him! Kill him!" At the word, they commenced firing. One ball shattered the doctor's wrist completely, causing the gun to drop from his hand, and he retreated back into the store, which he had hardly effected when a volley was poured in through the door and window of the counting room, into which they soon effected an entrance. But the doctor had escaped by another outlet, and was evidently endeavoring to reach the colonel's quarters, where he knew he would find protection. That would be Colonel Kit Carson. But it was not so to be, for scarcely had he left the store when the hue and cry was raised on every side by the yelling hounds. "There he goes! Kill him! Kill him!" While the crack of their rifles came from every quarter in quick succession, and the bullets fell like hail around him, until he fell exhausted and lifeless in a ditch which he could not leap. Nor did it end there, for volley after volley was poured into his body by the infuriated mob. After life was extinct, even the gallant Lieutenant Morris, completing the work he had commenced by discharging a double-barreled shotgun into the lifeless body, and ending the noble deed without the boast that he had finished the damned scoundrel. End all quotes. Dang. The coroner would later note that Whitlock had no less than 28 rifle balls and 98 buckshot that had filled his body. Graydon would die of his wounds, and then a few of the 100 men who shot at Whitlock would be arrested and court-martialed. Although I think I read that they escaped custody. I'm not sure. It's just another incredible story in the American Southwest that goes to show how violent the place really could be, even amongst allies. 2 weeks after Manuelito's death by Graydon, another detachment of California Federals surprised a group of mescaleros at a place known as Dog Canyon, and that was in the Sacramento Mountains. They killed a lot of Apache warriors and took the camp from the mescaleros. So this defeat, combined with Manuelito's death and the fact that Graydon and Carson were out there constantly looking for him, it convinced these White Mountain Apaches that resistance to the White Eyes was futile. Colonel Carson, disobeying orders to kill them all, he accepted the surrender of hundreds of Mescalero Apaches at Fort Stanton. He then distributed rations to the Apaches before having their leaders march with him and the newly arrived Indian agent up to Santa Fe to meet with Carleton. Now, during the meeting, one of the Apache leaders is noted as saying, quote, "You have driven us from our last and best stronghold, and we have no more heart. Do with us as may seem good to you, but do not forget we are men and braves." End quote. It was a valiant request that fell on deaf Union ears. Unfortunately for these Apache, Carleton did not honor their request to be remembered as men and braves. Instead, these Mescalero were the first to be relocated to the 40-square-mile infamous reservation known as the Bosque Redondo. The Bosque Redondo was located on the Pecos River in eastern New Mexico, and it was to be guarded by Fort Sumner, which had been a bastion of defense against the Comanche. The Mescaleros, some other Apaches, and the Navajo were all to be relocated to the Bosque, where they were to learn to farm and be productive, capitalist Americans. That was the plan anyway. In reality, the reservation was hell. The Apache, though, they were not alien to this spot of land, the round forest, Bosque Redondo. Before the White Mountain Mescalero Apache were up in the Sacramentos, their ancestors had been on the plains hunting the buffalo. And destroying a group of people known as the Humanos. So I just did a big Roadrunner episode, exclusive episode, over the entire Humanos history. I mean, I started before the language theory of the Aztec Tenoan. I started 6,000 years ago or so. The Humanos, though, they were the Mogollon peoples of southern Arizona and New Mexico. They made beautiful pottery. They built monumental architecture. But eventually, after the Great Migration of the 1300s and the fall of the Chaco and Anasazi Empire, the Humanos, their territory spread from southern Colorado to central Texas to northern Mexico to southern Arizona. They even had rancherias or camps near the San Francisco Mountains of Flagstaff. They had camps along the Texas coast in later years. It seems that most of the Southern Plains Indians spoke their language as a lingua franca. They had their own language, but they also spoke Humano. They had an enormous amount of territory, enormous amount of influence. They traded things from the coast and the Mississippians to the Southwest and vice versa. They had, again, this massive amount of territory. Territory that we have been calling Apacheria. And that is because the Apache took all of this land and the people's buffalo hunting grounds and their trading rights. They took it all away from the Humanos. The Humanos and the Apaches were bitter 300-year rivals, by my estimate. The Mogollons had probably built Montezuma Castle in Arizona, and like I mentioned in the Humanos episode and the episode over the Anasazi, legend has it, the Apache burned the Mogollons at Montezuma Castle. Mogollons, aka Humano. They had a very long history. Violent history. I believe I also mentioned that actually in this Apache series. Maybe the first episode. I almost wish I had read about the Humanos before starting this Apache series so that I could have included a lot of that information. But if you're a subscriber or a Roadrunner, you get to hear that awesome Humanos episode. But by the early 1800s, the Spanish were calling the Humanos the Humano Apache, because what few Humanos remained had indulged in the mantra, if you can't beat 'em, join 'em. So the Apache had a history with the Plains, the Buffalo Kingdom, but that had been a long time ago. That was before the Comanche did to the Apache what the Apache did to the Humano and kicked them out of their Buffalo Kingdom. The Mescaleros were now firmly mountain people. The Bosque Redondo would be hell. By March of 1862, some 400 Mescalero Apaches were at the Bosque, soon to be joined by their Navajo cousins. Meanwhile, Carson scoured the Sacramento and other mountain ranges for any Apache holdouts. By January of 1863, Carson reported to Carleton that the mountains had been cleared and the Indians at the reservation were safe to begin their planting. Now, in reality, over 100 Mescaleros were either still hiding in the mountains or they had fled west. The ones hiding in the mountains, they kind of mirror the story of the Navajo chief Hoskanini. I covered that in my subscriber-only episode over Height in Utah. sign up on the Substack to hear that awesome story of the silver and gold on the Colorado River. The other Mescaleros that had fled west, they went and joined the Chiricahua and the Gila Apaches. Now at this time, but not for much longer, only a couple months I believe, the Gila were still being led by Mangas Coloradas. He will soon be butchered. And that is where I left off the last episode. After Carson rounded up all these Mescaleros, sent them to the Bosque, he went over to Carleton and he attempted to resign. He didn't want to be fighting Indians, he wanted to fight rebels. Carleton apparently tore up his resignation and then sent him west to round up the Navajos. In that endeavor, he was much more brutal than he had been to the Mescaleros. As we'll talk about in just a minute, much like the Confederates had urged the Mexicans to fight with them against the Apache, the South also asked the O'odham to help them rid the territory of Apaches. I talked about the O'odham in the last few episodes. They shared a boundary with the Apaches, and they shared a hatred of them with the Mexicans and Americans. They were ancient enemies, much like the Humanos had been. Lieutenant Colonel Baylor, he urged, quote, the chiefs of the Papagos and Pima Indians to help me clean out the Apache Indians, end quote. Once the Yankees took over, they urged the same thing, except they used a couple hundred muskets and thousands of balls of ammunition to bribe the O'odham to help the Americans fight the Apaches. During this whole affair, the O'odham confused the heck out of the White Eyes, though. It seemed, and it was recorded, that although the O'odham knew very well how to use and how to reload and how to fire the weapons, they much preferred to use the rifles as clubs to bash the brains out of the Apaches instead of shooting them. And then, the offenders, needing to cleanse themselves, would leave the forts and just disappear. Not just cleanse, though, but also take the power of the dead Apache. Which is also why they didn't kill them from afar, because the O'odham would not be able to harness the power of the dead Apache during the cleansing ceremony if they shot them from a distance. Close personal combat was preferred for the O'odham, and the Americans just did not understand that. The O'odham, because of their past and their willingness to bring in scalps and ears for money, they were clearly a good ally for the Americans to have when Apache raids threatened the Arizona Territory, especially during the Civil War. I talked about those calendar sticks in the last episode, and I will talk about them again here. They are a great record. One of them had recorded 1864 to 1865. In a raid in this year, 2 Apaches were killed and their ears cut off and nailed on a stick. Another calendar stick recorded that in 1871, a group of about 100 O'odham with American and Mexican warriors surrounded an encampment in Aravaipa Canyon and killed everyone that was sleeping. I wonder where the Apache kid was at this time. He would have been 11. He was from Aravaipa Canyon. We will get into it later, but this is the Camp Grant Massacre. But one last story, and it is quite graphic and intimate, but it's worth telling. Quote, the men all separated, and each one waited outside one Apache wickiup, till the signal to attack. My father was outside a wickiup, where there were several women roasting something, and he listened to their strange voices and wondered if they were saying, the desert people are here. Finally the signal came, the call of a roadrunner. Our men attacked, whooping. The women ran out of the houses, and the men stood at the doors waiting to club them. My father took hold of an old woman, but she was strong, and wrestled with him. He called to the others, help! The old enemy woman is killing me! So others came, and they broke in the old woman's skull. A few other men were killed, but the rest of the women got away. Our men burned the houses and the booty, and went home. End quote. That rather intense story was told in Ruth Underhill's autobiography of a Papago woman from 1936, although this story took place in the late 19th century. And as I said, the O'odham play a critical role in Camp Grant's history. The Mexicans, so switching gears a little bit, the Mexicans who had been living in the United States since the Mexican-American War, a group of people known as vecinos, they weren't really interested in the American Civil War. They were more interested in the French and Austrian invasion of Old Mexico. Well, they were worried about that and the Apaches who were taking advantage of a lack of American troops in the area. Troops that had been recalled to the east to fight their brothers down south. One Tucson rancher, who'd only been an American for around 8 years after the Gadsden Purchase, he commented, quote, "The Indians were robbing and stealing everything they could. It was just a sort of civil war between us and the Indians." End quote. The Confederate leader of Arizona, the previously mentioned Lieutenant Colonel John Baylor, he spoke quite highly of these Mexican vecinos who fought with the South against the Apache during the brief time the Confederacy held Arizona. When the Union later occupied Arizona, the leader of the North's forces pretty much said the same thing that Baylor had. Later in 1862, the Union would organize several civilian companies who were promised that, quote, "they would be ordered against no enemy except the Apache." End quote. So don't worry, you won't be fighting Americans, you'll just be fighting Apache. And one of those civilian companies was ran by Carson himself that I mentioned briefly earlier. After the war, so 1866, one of these companies was a different one, was led by a man named Manuel Gallegos. And in February of 1866, Manuel Gallegos and E Company, they located a bunch of Apaches who were holed up in a cave. I will let Jacoby describe what happens next. Gallegos and his men surrounded the site during the night in an approach so silent that not even the Apache dogs detected their presence. As soon as daybreak offered enough light to see, the volunteers attacked. Within minutes, quote, "all of the caves that were accessible were filled with dead and wounded Apaches." End quote. As evidence of their success, Gallegos' unit brought back to their camp 13 Apache scalps along with 2 women and 10 children. End quote. Only a month later, Company A surrounded yet another Apache camp where a similar scene unfolded. Once the light appeared on the horizon, the Mexican-American vecinos killed 22 Apaches and took 2 captive. The governor of Arizona, territory governor of Arizona at that time, Richard McCormick, on account of Company E and Gallegos' bravery, he offered them extra rations of tobacco and a nice letter thanking them. In that letter he wrote, "Thank you, quote, for the severe blow you have dealt to our common and barbarous foe." End quote. He then went on to write about Gallegos' men and how, quote, "these native volunteers who are at home in the country are the men to hunt the Apache." End quote. I mean, that is because these men knew a little bit about hunting Apache after all. During the 1850s and 1860s, the Apache had constantly raided Tucson. Stealing hundreds, if not thousands, of cattle and horses, and killing quite a few of these vecinos. A story I read had one man from a prominent Spanish family that had been fighting the Apache for over a century. The story had him kidnapped and killed, and when his brothers found him, his hands had been smashed with rocks. And this was interpreted as suggesting the captured man was a brave warrior who put up a pretty good fight. A good enough fight for the Apache to smash his hands. This prominent family was named Elias. I mentioned in the last episode how many Eliases there were. Well, they're still here. And now, I don't know if it's the exact same family. I assume they have common ancestors. But now, the Eliases are on the American side of the border as well. Two of these Elias brothers were quite the Indian fighters. Those brothers were Juan and Jesus Elias. During the American Civil War, after losing a number of their other brothers to the Apache, Jesus and Juan, but especially Jesus, but the two would lead several of their men from Tucson with some O'odham and American volunteers, and they would raid Aravipa Canyon. And they would be quite successful. That is the raid on the calendar stick, and that is the raid we will talk about at the end of this episode. Long after that, these two brothers would actually go on to have political careers in Tucson and other parts of Arizona under the Americans. And Jesus would be a guide for the U.S. military in the region after the Civil War. Jesus would actually be of great value to the Americans, who had inherited the area and its, of course, history of violence. He could tell, apparently, by a footprint. Jesus could tell by a footprint what kind of Indian left it and if that Indian was barefoot or not. He had intimate knowledge of Indian footwear and just of the people. I mean, it sounds silly, but it was a very valuable skill, especially in tracking. He could read the land and the sand. Jesus could also speak and understand a little bit of Apache. He got so good at understanding their difficult language, trust me, it's difficult. He got so good that he could tell what band the Apache speaking was from. And this is all probably because he grew up with a captured Apache who actually took the name Jose Maria Elias. And Jose Elias' story is interesting. The Elias brothers said that Jose, he died suddenly of a disease, an unknown, unnamed disease, and they had to bury him in the forest where they were chopping wood. Like right there on the spot. But in reality, he probably fled from the Elias brothers and went back to the Apaches, where he became the leader of a band that would end up terrorizing the Mexicans on both sides of the international border well into the 1880s. The Eliases and the Apaches had quite the conflict, and both sides fought a feud during the 1860s and 1870s that makes the Graham-Tewksbury feud look like child's play. It was just constant tit-for-tat murders, raids, back-and-forth killings, surprise night attacks. One time they shot Elias's brothers while they were sleeping outside. The Eliases would hunt Apache thieves at night and gun them down. This happened for over a decade. But the Elias had been in the area since around 1720, fighting and killing Apaches, pretty much since that time, and being killed by them as well. And get this, Jesus Elias, who was the main target of the Apaches' hate, he caught sight of some of the Apaches one night and realized that the leaders of these attempted murderers that were trying to kill him and his brothers that very night, they were none other than Esquiminzin and Capitan Chiquito. Esquiminzin briefly owned the kidnapped Felix, and Capitan Chiquito, he was the leader of the band of Apache that the Apache Kid belonged to. So for that Apache Kid story, again, subscribe, become a Roadrunner. I actually opened the entire Apache Kid series with a great quote from Capitan Chiquito. The quote said, "It seems to me that God gave everything to the white man and nothing to the Indian, and so you must expect the Indian to help himself to what he needs." End quote. Because of these raids, and many like it, the Army would set up Fort Grant near Tucson. And this was to protect farmers and ranchers along the San Pedro River and in Aravipa Canyon. That very significant place for the Apache. And the O'odham before them. But again, Fort Grant will become very important to our story soon, and so will Esquiminzin. Back over in the east, at the Bosque Redondo, that horrible reservation of Navajo and Apache, things were not going well. While it was indeed a lush environment, it was mostly lush with grass. There weren't a lot of trees, definitely not enough to build all the buildings the fort would need, not to mention the homes for the Indians. One soldier commented on Fort Sumner's hospital and called it only suitable for to keep pigs in. The locals were none too thrilled with the reservation either. Mexican, American vecinos, and Americans. Anglo. First of all, they didn't want that many Indians next to them, but also the government took the lush grassland from ranchers to house the Indians. Sure, they paid the ranchers, but no one likes eminent domain. Not to mention the Pecos would often flood, which would wipe out any crops the Apaches were attempting to plant, which is the whole reason why they were there in the first place. And that flooded water would often spread dysentery to both the Apaches and amongst the troops guarding them. It was not an easy place to live, despite Carleton's insistence that the Indians not only live, but make a living at the spot. The very capable Indian agent, Agent Steck, that I talked so much about in the last episode, he would complain to Carleton of the horrible conditions at the Bosque. But Carleton told him essentially, look, New Mexico is under my martial law, so you can do what I say, or you can resign. Other Indian agents, especially one named Labadie, he also complained, and even the leader of the fort, a man named Criminy, he would complain as well. But all the complaints fell on Carleton's deaf ears. After one particular raid on the Apaches at the Bosque by the Navajos, Criminy and Labadie, the Indian agent, these two Anglos actually rode into battle with the Mescalero against the Navajo in retaliation. Obviously, this would infuriate Carleton, who would banish Labadie from the territory and from New Mexico. And obviously, Criminy, too, would get in trouble. Then, to make matters worse, Carson was just too effective at rounding up the Navajos. Too effective and brutal. Eventually, 8,000 Navajos would ride into the Bosque Redondo, which would just make the whole reservation almost completely unlivable. I mean, first of all, obviously that was just too many people. Second, the Mescalero and Navajo, they were cousins, but they were bitter enemies with scores to settle. And lastly, the military, in its infinite wisdom, as soon as they arrived, the army gave the Navajos the already planted and tilled land the Apaches had been working on since their own arrival. Clearly, this was just not going to work. Carson and Criminy told Carleton as much, and, well, much to my own surprise, Carleton agreed. Something had to be done. I mean, this definitely does not sound like the man who ordered every Apache and Navajo man to be killed without warning, while essentially imprisoning all the women and children, but Carleton would write to Lincoln's Republican Congress and say, hey, if we don't get this problem solved in this reservation I established, the Indians over here under my command will die by the thousands. I mean, what he wrote is almost laughable, since the U.S. was killing its southern brothers by the hundreds of thousands. But he wrote, quote, with other tribes whose lands we have acquired ever since the Pilgrims stepped on shore at Plymouth, this has been done too often. For pity's sake, if not moved by any other consideration, let us as a great nation, for once, treat the Indian as he deserves to be treated. End quote. I have no idea where this change of heart came from. Maybe it's because he wanted what the Congress was about to give him, but the Republican Congress felt more pity for the Apaches and Navajos, apparently, than their southern brothers. But the nation at war decided Carleton was right, and they approved $100,000 in food, clothing, and farming tools for the Bosque. But, of course, it didn't turn out as great as Carleton, Carson, Criminy, and the Indians would have liked for it to. Hutton writes of this money laundering, which is what ended up happening, but Hutton writes of this, quote, it was far too little and much too late. The supplies that eventually reached the reservation were barely serviceable. Broken and surplus goods had been unloaded from the eastern warehouses of war profiteers so that the Indians received moth-eaten clothing, flimsy bolts of cloth, and rusted or defective farming tools. Blankets, billed at $22 to the government, weighed a pound less than the standard issue military blanket that cost $4.50. And so it went As the Indians were defrauded, venal contractors made huge profits, and the Republican politicos in Washington looked the other way. End quote. It's almost as if government spending huge sums of money on wars has always been about benefiting those who are already making a profit on death and destruction. Criminy, although disheartened by this whole affair, continued to fight for the Mescaleros that he had under his charge. All the while, he would spend a lot of time talking with them, learning from them, hunting with them. He'd even participate in their ceremonies. He thinks he truly came to understand the Apaches. He came to look up to them and their refusal to assimilate and become slaves to the American way. A Mescalero chief named Cadete, he even tried to convince Criminy in the errors of the American way. He told him in 1865 in a lengthy argument against modernity, he said, quote, "You say that because you learned from books you can build all these big houses and talk with each other any distance and do many wonderful things. Now let me tell you what we think. You begin when you are little to work hard, and work until you are men in order to begin fresh work. You say that you work hard in order to learn to work well. After you get to be men, then you say, the labor of life commences. Then you build the houses and ships and towns and everything. Then after you have got them all, you die and leave them behind. Now, we call that slavery. You are slaves from the time you begin to talk until you die, but we are free as air. We never work, but the Mexicans and others work for us. Our wants are few and easily supplied. The river, the wood, and plain yield all that we require, and we will not be slaves." End quote. Now, as host, I get to editorialize this incredible quote that it's ridiculous. I mean, sure, it sounds great. I mean, why be a slave to the system, man? Capitalism is evil. But then there was one sentence that gave the whole game away. We never work, but the Mexicans and others work for us. Well, isn't that nice? We are not slaves, but we do have slaves. We have slaves that we not only steal from, but pretty regularly kill. Actually, entire Mexican towns we kill. We also kidnap their children. It's just, come on. Before the Mexicans, the Apaches stole from the Humanos. I mean, they completely wiped out the Humanos. The once great Mogollon people, they are no more because the Apaches stole everything from their bison to their crops to their pottery. They stole everything from the Humanos people. They also stole from the Puebloans before they stole from the Mexicans and the Spanish. Before that, well, there had to be a reason they were kicked out of the Great White North, as the Canadian Chippewayan chief Tihon told Ingstead. Sure, it's nice to have everyone else do the work for you as you profit off their quote-unquote slave labor. I mean, no wonder the Apache didn't want to assimilate. And then there's the line, the river, the wood, and plain yield all that we require, and we will not be slaves. Yeah, if that yielded all you require, then why would you raid whenever the rations don't come, or you have a bad hunt, or a bad crop season? Now, of course, the Apache, as you have been listening to for quite a few episodes, the Apache had more than their share of depredations and raids and murders and massacres, as you're about to hear, and kidnappings. They had plenty of those perpetrated against them. I hope I've gone over both sides pretty equally. This quote just, it gets me, frustrated. The audacity. I mean, he sounds like a modern day. Never mind. And meanwhile, by the way, in the East, the South was in talks with European nations to offload their entire slave population on European ships to either the Caribbean or back to Africa. Maybe that's not the best solution for the people who were kidnapped and brought here. But the South's minority slave-holding population was willing to give up their slaves and their means of making a living, albeit on the backs of others, but the South was willing to emancipate their slaves if it meant an end to the war. Not the Apache, though. Oh, no. They would never settle down, Christianize, and farm. And Union Commander Criminy was sympathetic to this, but not to the South. We should have mercy on the Apache because this is their way of life. The South? Oh, we should burn every one of their cities, set them back for half a century, and kill their men because their way of life is not worth a lick. Hopefully I did not lose too many of my listeners there. I apologize for that rant. This quote is just crazy. We never work, but the Mexicans and others work for us. I mean, okay, sorry. A few months after that conversation, in November of 1865, this chief cadete, he would sneak his entire people away from Bosque Redondo in the middle of the night, and they would go back to their mountains near Sierra Blanca. The other Apache at the reservation either joined the Comanche on the plains, joined the Chiricahua Apaches in the Mogollon Mountains, or they went south to join the Lipan Apache. When Criminy arrived on the morning of November 4th, only 8 sick Apaches remained. And they would soon be gone too. Hutton writes, quote, "No soldiers were sent in pursuit, but from that day forward, the Mescaleros were again at war with the Americans." End quote. So not only were the Chiricahua of Cochise at war, but the Mescaleros were now at war with the White Eyes as well. But backing up just a little bit, in 1863, President Lincoln, after having been persuaded by the Charles Poston that I talked about in the last episode, well, Lincoln finally split New Mexico into New Mexico and Arizona. The line chosen to separate the two territories is today's border of the 109th meridian. All during the Civil War, Carleton had set up multiple forts all across Apacheria and Dineta, from Apache Pass, the site of the cutting of the tent, to just north of modern-day Prescott, which would become the territorial capital. It is not Phoenix, it is Prescott. If y'all can, recall the man who tricked Mangas, that man Jack Swilling. Well, 2 months after Mangas' death, he and a bunch of other miners set out from Pinos Altos towards Prescott, because gold was soon to be discovered there. A mountain of the stuff, really. A mountain of gold that the Apaches had kept from the White Eyes for centuries. The White Eyes and the Mexicans. The cat was now out of the bag. Jack Swilling would strike it rich with a find of $500,000. He would then sell that claim and then get in on the irrigation digging business. And he would turn the scorching desert around the Salt River into Phoenix, Arizona. And like I just mentioned, that town would eventually replace Prescott as the territorial capital. Swilling would send 2 of these nuggets to Carleton, over in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And the Union general would say of the ex-Confederate, who captured Mangas Coloradas, quote, "I sincerely congratulate you on your fortune and believe no one better deserves it than yourself." End quote. Swilling is a fascinating character, and maybe I'll do a deep dive into him one of these days for Roadrunners. Carleton would ship one of these nuggets that the Confederate Jack Swilling gave him to Lincoln in D.C. And with it, he would plead for more soldiers to guard the miners against Apache attacks. He wrote, quote, "If I can but have troops to whip away the Apaches so that prospecting parties can explore the country and not be in fear all the time of being murdered, you will, without the shadow of a doubt, find that our country has mines of the precious metals unsurpassed in richness, number, and extent by any in the world." End quote. Lincoln could spare no troops at this time. By 1865, the war in the East drew to a close. Carleton was stripped of his command, and reduced to a lieutenant colonel, partly on how he treated the Indians, and partly on his enactment of martial law, he'd become an embarrassment. This is back when being an embarrassment meant you lost your job, not just promoted upwards. Arizona was given to the Department of the Pacific at this time, and the California troops that had marched in and kicked out the Confederates, they were sent home. And the Bosque Redondo, with its awful conditions, was investigated by none other than General Sherman, who, in a kind of funny way, remarked that with how much they were spending on the Navajo in this failed reservation, quote, "I think we could better send them to the Fifth Avenue Hotel to board," end quote. By 1868, the Navajo were sent back to Dineta, where they would make peace with the White Eyes and even be used as Apache scouts. And I will talk about them in the next episode. Even though hundreds of Navajo died at the Bosque, it could be said that was a better fate than the 20 years of war that was barreling towards the Apache. In 1865, with the close of the war, the U.S. Army moved back into the newly created territory of Arizona. There were, at that time, around 5,526 non-Indian Americans living there, and that number included Johnny Ward, the stepfather of the kidnapped boy, along with his wife Maria and their 5 other children. So they would end up moving near the reoccupied Tubac, and they would farm. All the while, they were assuming that their son was dead. In response to the Apache threat, the newly re-arrived U.S. Army built a string of forts all over the territory of Arizona, and there were about 2,000 troops in them by 1869. It was something like 1/5 of the entire army. Places like Camp Breckenridge, Camp McDowell, and Camp Grant were all built. And these forts contained both infantry and cavalry alike, and they were all combing the land for Apaches. The whole endeavor was extremely expensive for the United States, and the man in charge of it all was Sherman himself. And this cost would be why he remarked that, quote, "We had one war with Mexico to take Arizona, and we should have another to make her take it back," end quote. I mean, Arizona is indeed one heck of a place. There are scorching temperatures that soar well over 100, sometimes reaching 120. There are vast stretches of seemingly impenetrable desert where everything has thorns or venom. It's all trying to kill you. I mean, there's prickly pear, saguaro, cholla trees, spiders, snakes. Heck, even the Gila monster is venomous. It don't rain, but when it does, it pours. It's sandy, it's dusty. The rocks are sharp. The mountains seem impassable. If I didn't love the American Southwest enough to explore it intimately and even live in it, I'd probably tend to agree with the vile general. I know, certainly, when I grew up in Georgia, before ever visiting, I never wanted to visit the desert. When my parents told me, when I was 15, that we're moving to Oklahoma, I specifically said, "Oklahoma? There's nothing in the desert." Now, I didn't know that Oklahoma wasn't the desert, but I would soon find out. And then I would soon visit the desert and fall deeply in love with it. But this was the land that the many American troops found themselves in. And when they weren't fighting to the death with Apaches, they were fighting the deadliness of boredom. Arizona's Anglo and Mexican residents, Arizona's U.S. Army cavalry and infantry troops, and Arizona's Indian population, none of them had it easy in the territory. The non-Indian civilians were constantly complaining. I mean, they needed more troops, they needed more infantry, more cavalry to protect them. Meanwhile, the U.S. Army was complaining that the citizens were ungrateful and antagonistic towards them while they were trying to guard them. And of course, the Indians wanted everyone out. Everyone had a valid claim, too. The citizens were constantly being attacked. They were attacked in their fields, at their mines, while the number of soldiers in the army were constantly being cut to pre-war numbers. It also did not help that the territory was being filled with ex-Confederates who were escaping the draconian and unconstitutional martial law of Reconstruction, only to be then protected by Buffalo Soldiers, of whom some of these ex-Confederates had a distaste for, if you can imagine. I won't go into the Buffalo Soldiers too much in this, or any of these episodes, because I did a whole series on them. So you should check that out. If you haven't already, check it out after I'm done with the whole Apache series. It's one of those times where I just wanted to talk about Buffalo Soldiers. But now that I'm talking about the Grand Apache Wars, probably would have been helpful to include some of the stories I had in those episodes in these. So check them out when I'm done with the Apache series, eventually. Also at this time, desertions were at 30% or above for these far-flung posts, and oftentimes the deserters would take off with a horse or two, and their rifle and some supplies. Many officers even suggested that the local residents would then buy these stolen goods from the deserters and then just resell them to the army. A lot of these citizens made a living only selling goods to the army. It's the only reason why they were out there. Hence why they wanted a bigger presence of the army. Then there is the reward to the locals for these deserters. It was only $20. Not to mention, desertion may have been the goal. The only reason why some of these people were in the army to begin with. Many of these men were fresh off the boat from Europe, and they were looking for an easy way west to California and Arizona, to their gold mines, to their silver mines, copper mines. As Hutton puts it, there were more European immigrants getting off the eastern boats every single month than there were all of the Apaches combined. And in the next episode, we will talk about General Crook, who will make this exact statement to the Apaches. We'll get into that. Another problem the Arizonans had was that the Southwest would, in 1870, be carved into two distinct regions. Arizona would be in the Department of the Pacific, and it would be ran out of Los Angeles by an ineffective leader we'll talk about in a moment. And New Mexico, with Texas, would be ran by Lieutenant General Sheridan of the Department of the Missouri. That made these two separations, that made combined efforts difficult and sometimes impossible between the two armies. Especially when it came to the Chiricahuas, who were right there on the border, and they would just fly between the Chiricahua Mountains and the Mogollon Mountains. The Mogollon Mountains are in New Mexico, Chiricahua Mountains are in Arizona. The leader of the Department of the Pacific was a man named Colonel Stoneman, and he was quite ineffective. He hated Arizona. He was, like so many future Californians, unable to tolerate anything but California's quasi-Mediterranean, easy climate. Stoneman, like Lucille Bluth, would literally rather be dead in California than alive in Arizona. He called Tucson a quote-unquote hot, sickly town. And he decided he'd rather run the violent, harsh, incredibly complicated situation and territory that was Arizona. He'd rather run it all from Los Angeles. And from his nice Los Angeles lair, he wrote to D.C. instead of Arizona, quote, "The Apache Nation is nearly harmless." End quote. Imagine. He also wrote that the Indian affairs were, quote, "in a satisfactory condition as can reasonably be expected." End quote. Good to know leaders in that state have never been competent. I would know. I lived there for a year and a half. Sorry, Californians. This, by the way, was the satisfactory condition that Stoneman was talking about. Between 1866 and 1870 in Arizona, 26 American soldiers were killed and 58 were wounded. And there were 137 skirmishes with the Apaches. In New Mexico, that number of skirmishes was only about 33, but the fighting there was just as fraught. Traveling through the area was an incredibly dangerous adventure. Poston, the old stage man, he compiled a list of 425 Americans killed in the territory between the years 1856 and 1862. And then another 170 Americans killed between 1865 and 1874. In Pima County, Arizona alone, between July of 1868 and July 1869, more than 50 Americans were killed by the Apache. And over the next year, another 47 would lose their lives in raids. The Apache were inflicting significant fear and death upon the Americans. And the problems only seemed to be mounting. Photographer and writer William Bell wrote in his War of the Rebellion that the entire area of the American Southwest had been under attack for 1,000 years by the Apache. He wrote, quote, "The Indians really have possession of this territory. It is feared that the Hualapai, the Yavapai, and the different tribes of Apaches, with some straggling Navajos, have combined for the purpose of exterminating the whites." End quote. Bell then goes on to mention the Hohokam ruins of Casa Grande, the canals, and other monumental architecture that were left around the Phoenix Basin. He correctly surmised that they had once been farmers and sedentary, the people who built these ruins. He then incorrectly states that eventually they were wiped out by the Apache. He actually wrote that the Hohokam had been wiped out by the Apaches who, quote, "have been waging for ages unceasing war against the cultivator of the soil." End quote. Meaning, the Apache really hate farmers. Which is not true, we know now. I mean, as Mangas Coloradas said, we don't want to kill all the Mexicans because then who would grow our food for us? While he's wrong about the Hohokam, the Apache, I believe, did wipe out the Mogollon to the north and the east of Phoenix. They probably burned Montezuma's castle, and they definitely contributed to the destruction of the Mogollon's descendants, the Humanos. Now, the Anglo and Mexican settlers of the area, they believed they were next. To combat this impending doom, the Arizonans began their own policy of extermination. One Kentuckian sent by Lincoln to Arizona, named Daniel Ellis Connor, he remarked that, quote, "it was the rigid rule all over the country to shoot these savages upon sight." End quote. Another man sent by Lincoln to be a judge in Arizona, a man named Joseph Allen, he said, quote, "a war of extermination has in fact already begun. Indians are shot wherever seen." End quote. Not only shot when seen, but also invited to feasts with food and drink and then shot in the back of the head. This very thing happened in 1864, and 30 Apaches were massacred in what became known as the Massacre at Bloody Tanks. Now, I also read that only 19 Apaches were killed, and I also read that it was during a pitched battle, not in this cowardly style, so I'm not really sure. But it doesn't matter. A whole bunch of Apaches were murdered. War had overtaken both sides, and it was getting pretty brutal. One American wrote at the time that the Apache were like ghosts. He said, quote, "we have a horror of them, that you feel for a ghost. We never see them, but when on the road are always looking over our shoulders in anticipation. When they strike, all we see is the flash of the rifle resting with secure aim over a pile of stones." End quote. The ghost sickness, different from the Apache form, but this American ghost sickness is what infected them and caused them to shoot any Apache they saw on the street or in the wilderness. After all, they thought, this Apache could have been the one that shot my friend, or my wife, or stole my cattle or my child. And if he ain't, well, he might be one day. One historian, named Philip Deloria, he termed this defensive conquest. It is essentially what captured the West for the Americans. It was a cycle of violence that both sides could not have stopped, even if they had wanted to. It was as inevitable as manifest destiny. Yet another factor that made matters worse for the military and civilians of the American Southwest, that was the Indian Bureau, or as the Army officers called it, the Indian Ring. The Indian Ring was accused of being ran by, according to Hutton, quote, crooked politicians, thieving bureaucrats, profiteering capitalists, and misguided humanitarians, end quote. These men would swindle both the government and the Indians out of, well, everything the Indians were owed. Essentially, NGOs would lobby the government to do something, whatever they wanted them to do, and then the government would do that by spending money, which would then go back into the hands of the politicians, the unelected officials, and the people who ran the NGOs. And NGOs are non-governmental organizations. The United States right now is rife with them. Which, as a matter of fact, this whole Indian Ring sounds curiously like our current Defense Department. NGOs, unelected officials, politicians, cycling money. In 1868, General of the Union Army, General Grant, he was elected president. And in his inaugural speech in 1869, he said of the Indians, which certainly included the Apache, he said of them, quote, the proper treatment of the original occupants of this land, the Indians, is one deserving of careful study. I will favor any course toward them which tends to their civilization and ultimate citizenship. End quote. So unlike the Mexicans and Carleton of the Union Army, annihilation was not the stated policy of this administration. Although certain military leaders and civilians in the Southwest would prosecute the war against the original occupants of this land a little differently. President Grant, though, after this speech, he would immediately meet with liberal advocates in D.C., the same liberal abolitionist advocates who pushed for a war in the South to free the slaves. This time, the progressives wanted a new reservation system and to bring all the Indians in the nation unto Christ. A month after the speech, Congress would establish the Board of Indian Commissioners, which was staffed with religious leaders and progressive reformers to do just that, which was to get the Indians onto reservations and to teach them the gospel. At the same time, the old treaties, they were deemed moot, and the new Indian peace policy was led by a Seneca Indian named Eli Parker. He had actually been Grant's aide during the Civil War. And the Seneca, they are quite a distance from the Southwest. Their homeland is in the state of New York. This, though, his appointment, would mark the first time that the leader of the federal government's Indian policy was actually ran by an Indian. So, under this uniform peace policy, which everyone had to follow, there was no more making your own treaties or deals with independent Indian nations or tribes. Also, importantly, the military could not enter the reservation or conduct any affairs on any reservation unless specifically invited into the reservation by the Indian agent. On the flip side, though, any Indians off the reservation were deemed hostile and were free to be fired upon. As Hutton points out, though, the Apaches, at this time, they had no reservations. So how were they supposed to be treated? To make matters even more complicated, the first Indian agents appointed by the Federals were Quakers, the completely nonviolent sect of Christians that settled Pennsylvania and the Northeast. Essentially, the original progressives. They were the ones to turn the Indians peaceful, or quote-unquote good. General Sheridan, in response to all of this, sarcastically and infamously said, quote, "The only good Indian is a dead Indian." End quote. That is actually where that saying comes from. It seems the people of the American Southwest agreed with Sheridan. One Texas newspaper at the time wrote, quote, "Give us Phil Sheridan and send philanthropy to the devil." End quote. The people of the Southwest, they not only believed they were under attack by the Apache, but with these policies, they felt they were now under attack by the federal government as well. I mean, that makes sense on account of some of these Southwesterners being ex-rebs, but the policies the government were laying out, they did seem like they were going to do more harm to the Americans than good. The Weekly Arizona in 1869 printed, quote, "The Indian and the government maintain the present harmony in the project of crushing out the settler." End quote. Of course, if you're an Indian, not necessarily an Apache, but if you were an Indian in the nation, the United States, this was welcome news, this peace policy. Although instead of physical annihilation, this policy would ultimately lead to cultural annihilation. I mean, that was its stated goal. Assimilation meant Christianize and capitalize. In 1870, the Indian Commission did in fact create a reservation in Apacheria. It was called Fort Apache, and the Apache steered quite clear of it. One officer was quoted as saying something to the effect that the few Apache who came in were impossible to guard once they'd arrived anyways. In reality, many Arizonans felt like they were the ones in reservations. They were confined to settlements where they could protect themselves, while the Indians were still free to roam around. I mean, the Mexicans and Spaniards had once felt the same way. But really, the Apache, they were free to roam around, but they were constantly surprised in their hiding places and in their rancherias and regularly slaughtered, including their women and children. Jacoby's book, it goes a little too hard with the brutality that the Americans perpetrated upon the Apaches. There were two horrendous stories that were told that paint the Americans as straight up evil. And then, at the end of those two horrible stories, the author goes on to remark that the men who perpetrated these horrendous anecdotes, they were clearly insane, with one even being acquitted by the court-martial on account of him being literally insane. So I don't think that those two stories that he shared were appropriate to show how the Americans treated the Apaches. Although, if you have been listening, the Americans occasionally did treat the Apaches horribly. And the whole point of this episode is to kind of hammer that home with the Camp Grant massacre. I just hope that I am being a little less biased than some of the books that I read, which some of them went too hard for the Americans, especially the early books, and some went too hard for the Apaches, like the newer books. And some, like Hutton's, are pretty well in the middle. I try to be that. I mean, I can clearly and obviously relate to both sides of this huge Apache saga. But being an Anglo-American who lives in Apacheria, and I live in Apacheria in peace, I am definitely biased. Since the cutting of the tent in Apache Pass, Cochise and Mangas, so back a little bit, they had been the boogeymen of the era and the area. They were indeed free to run around as they pleased. Of course, after Mangas' murder, the sole owner of the boogeyman mantra did become Cochise, and every depredation, death, and desecration in both northern Mexico and the American Southwest, all of them were blamed on Cochise and his band, the Chiricahua. And there were plenty of those things going on. Newspapers at the time reported on all of them, all of these depredations and deaths. Newspapers reported on them, whether they were real or imagined. The Apaches, despite what Dakluji said to Eve Ball, did in fact mutilate the corpses of the dead with great frequency at least in these days. Really though, since 1862, since the big battle at Apache Pass, Cochise had taken his people to Mexico, where they were hiding out. I mean, of course they would return and raid New Mexico and Arizona in the summers, but they felt safe down in Mexico, away from the White Eyes. That is until 1868, when the Mexican government, freshly liberated from Emperor Maximilian I, which is a very fascinating story, which I implore everyone to look into. But ever since ridding themselves of the Emperor of Mexico in 1867, the Mexican government was able to focus again on the Apache problem in their north. So in 1868, they manned the Presidio at Janos with a new garrison. This effectively shut off the Apaches' trade with the Mexicans. Oh, and they renewed the scout bounty, because apparently Mexico never learned from that mistake. But the new garrison at Janos and the scout bounty, they combined would force Cochise and his Chiricahua back north into the Dragoon Mountains, which are near Tombstone, Arizona. Obviously, this caused even more year-round problems for the Americans in southern Arizona over the next couple of years. In 1869, Cochise and his warriors would capture mail carriages, they would kill Texas cowboys that were moving cattle, and they would slaughter prominent mine owners. Now, in response, the U.S. Army would send patrols out to chase them down, but they too would be ambushed and a few American soldiers killed. I talked about those numbers earlier. In those days, as one cavalry sergeant noted, it was the right rule to always leave one bullet in reserve. No one wanted to be captured by Cochise, and that one bullet in reserve was to make sure you weren't tortured to death. The leader of this cavalry unit that would chase Cochise, the 1st Cavalry, his name was Captain Bernard, and he and his Mexican, once kidnapped by Apache scout, named Grijalva. So Captain Bernard and Grijalva, they constantly pursued Cochise into the various mountains, and this constant pursuing and running, it forbade Cochise and his Chiricahua from ever settling down and having a quiet life or planting. Grijalva said at this time, quote, "When you go hunting for Apaches, you have in your mind's eye what you are going to do, but you can never know what you may be led into or what you are going to find. It is a very uncertain business." End quote. So this whole time was uncertain for both Cochise and his Chiricahua, who were always on the run, and for the army, who were always chasing him, sometimes getting ambushed. Felix, a.k.a. Mickey Free, the kidnapped boy, he is the focal point of Paul Andrew Hutton's incredible and broad book, The Apache Wars. And so there is a lot on the important boy. I mean, his kidnapping did cause the cutting of the tent with Cochise, which would lead to Mangus's death, and it would lead to the longest war in American history, as Hutton's title suggests. This American Apache War lasted nearly 25 years, which is indeed longer than our 19.9-year-long war in Afghanistan. So eventually, Mickey Free, after being kidnapped and given to the chief Esquiminzin, he was then traded by the chief, to a shaman for some special medicine. This shaman then traded the boy to an Apache named Nayundei. Nayundei and his family would eventually come to treat the prisoner slave as their own child. They would show him love and compassion. The boy would grow up with his adopted brother, and the two would become hunters, going after pack rats and other small game in the desert. The boys would race up mountains with their mouths full of water, only to race back down again and spit out all the water. This was a way that the Apaches would train their young men to become warriors. The boys were taught to harvest the mezcal and the pine nuts. Felix would participate in the Apaches' gambling, which was their favorite pastime, The Apaches would basically wager on everything, like everything that you could possibly wager on. DeCluge even says in Eve Ball's Enda that gambling was the Apaches' favorite pastime. Like, you wouldn't want to say the name of someone who had died, because what if in the happy place they were gambling and you called them away from their gambling game? The Apaches would wager on horse races, foot races, their other favorite game, hoop and pole game. Everything that could be would be wagered on by the Apache. Mickey Free would later tell Americans about the ceremonies he witnessed. One of them being the all-important girls' puberty ceremony. There was another ceremony, though, where he witnessed a dancer jump through the fire without getting hurt. He also witnessed another shaman dancer who stabbed himself in the chest with a knife and survived. Actually, I will let Hutton tell you about this because it's an interesting story. Among his most vivid memories was the fire dance, in which medicine men holding wands of eagle feathers jumped through fire untouched. Quote, "They would stagger about as if drunk," he recalled years later, "and scatter fire all over themselves without hurting themselves." End quote. On another occasion, a medicine man won over the people by stabbing himself. "Give me a knife," Felix remembered the shaman declaring. "See, I plunge it in my breast. Make me a cigarette." He smoked the cigarette, and the smoke from it emerged out of his chest. Quote, "I saw it with my own eyes," end quote, Felix declared. "I saw the blood and the smoke come together." End all quotes. And that is a wild story. And I almost wish I could see it. Almost. So by now, the young kidnapped boy had become a White Mountain Apache. So much so that when they saw a group of American soldiers camped near the Gila River in their mountains, the kidnapped boy did not mention to the White Eyes that he was not an Apache. Little did Felix know, and maybe he no longer cared, but in May of 1867, the Apaches once again stole from his stepfather, Johnny Ward. The Apaches yet again raided the man's ranch and took all of his livestock in broad daylight. Johnny Ward was injured in this attack, and eventually, in October of 67, he would die from his wounds. His wife, Felix's mother, she would end up selling the ranch and everything else for barely anything at all, and she moved herself and her children back to Sonora. She wouldn't survive the trip, though, and with a broken heart, she got sick and passed away in Magdalena. Her kids, Felix's siblings and step-siblings, they would be given to family members throughout the land. As such was life in the harsh frontier. We will hear more on Felix, aka Mickey Free, in the next episode. In the same year that Grant was elected president, the year 1868, in that same year, a once-disgraced Wisconsin war hero named Howard Cushing, he would come back from a 1-year suspension, and he would prove himself in the West against the Apache. He did have quite the name to defend, but he would uphold its status during his time in command of F Troop in the 3rd Cavalry. One of Cushing's brothers had actually died at Gettysburg, and another one had been a quote-unquote daring naval commander. Podcast alumni author David Roberts, in his Apache book titled Once They Moved Like the Wind, Roberts called Cushing, quote, the best Indian fighter the Army in Arizona had, end quote. In New Mexico and Texas, Cushing fought the Lipan and Mescalero Apaches before being transferred to Arizona, specifically to a place called Camp Grant. And this was in March of 1870. At the same time that Cushing arrived, a second lieutenant, John G. Burke, would also arrive to Camp Grant. a place that he called, quote, the most forlorn parody upon a military garrison in that most woe-begone of military departments, Arizona. End quote. He didn't think much highly of the place. I have mentioned Burke before, but we will hear a lot about him in the next couple episodes. Camp Grant was actually established in 1860, before the war, as Fort Aravaipa. It sits at the intersection of the San Pedro River and that all-important Aravaipa Canyon. Today, the marker for the fort is south of Globe on Highway 77, which is far southwest of Phoenix. At the time, it was a very good defensive spot that was on a hill that overlooked roads and rivers. It was eventually renamed to Fort Breckenridge, but Union soldiers burned that down at the beginning of the war. Later, the Californians under Carleton, they would reoccupy it, and by 1865, it was known as Camp Grant, after the Civil War Union leader and future president. This is where Cushing and Burke would serve, and this is where what would become known as the Camp Grant Massacre would occur. Burke would serve under Cushing, and he would remember Cushing's, quote, determination, coolness, and energy, end quote. But Burke had his own strengths, and he would be an avid studier of the Southwest and its people, while also being an invaluable chronicler of all that he saw and participated in. One of the first things he saw, unfortunately, was something I will let Hutton tell you about. Quote, Burke had hardly settled into his new quarters before he was shocked by a local custom. Among the first Apaches he met at Camp Grant was a woman whose nose had been cut off by a jealous husband. Quote, the woman was not at all bad looking, Burke noted, and there was not a man at the post who did not feel sorry for the unfortunate who, for some dereliction, real or imagined, had been so savagely disfigured. End all quotes. And this scenario is despite the Apaches' adverseness towards mutilation. And it was actually a common practice among some in the tribe, of many bands, especially when it came to wives who committed adultery. According to Apache custom, some Apache customs, of course, husbands were in the right to kill their wives, and their wives' lovers if they were caught in the act. And affairs weren't all too uncommon. I mean, some of these warriors were gone for months at a time. But as Hutton points out, it was up to the tribal leaders to insist on a cool head for the slighted husband. If not cutting off of the nose, banishment was often the punishment. Another strange part of this is that the Apache thought that twins were a sign of infidelity. So twins were a bad omen. According to an Apache elder, though, more often than not, if an Apache man, quote, finds out she is unfaithful, he whips her, cuts her nose, or else kills her. End quote. For the men? Well, that's a different story. Unfaithful men were often called night crawlers, and they could easily get away with such frivolities. This practice of cutting or killing a woman was actually used as an excuse for why the Apaches should be dominated and reformed by radical Republican liberals in D.C. Burke would even brag about making new laws for the Apache in regards to these depredations. He would write that one of the first laws he, quote, laid down for their guidance was that the women of the tribe must be treated just as kindly as the men. End quote. So I guess Afghanistan was not the first time we forced liberal educations and Western values onto a foreign enemy we were also killing. Come to think of it, the entire Second World War. Never mind. I also think back to the conquistadors and the meme of, your human sacrifices will stop now, because there are some things which a culture can come in and see and view as, this is horrendous, you got to stop. And so Bork may have been in the right to say, hey, you can't cut your wife's nose off or kill her if she has cheated on you. There's a lot of editorializing in this episode. Hope everyone is okay with that. By 1870, Cochise had moved back up into the United States to his beloved Dragoon Mountains of southern Arizona. He was pursuing his reign of vengeful terror after all. One southern Arizona pioneer, a man named John Spring, said that in these years, quote, Cochise's band killed no less than 34 of my friends and acquaintances within a radius of 50 miles of Calabasas. End quote. Well, Cushing, he was there to put a stop to that. Or at least he had to try. So beginning in August of 1870, Cushing began dealing crushing defeats to the Apache. His men were constantly in the field, no longer fighting boredom. He destroyed and burned to the ground a total of 5 Apache rancherias over the next 6 months. He killed numerous Apache, over 30 in one raid alone, and he destroyed their crops everywhere he went. As Hutton in Apache Wars puts it, quote, the Apaches came to recognize his face as the enemy. End quote. During one punitive raid, Cushing pushed deep into Mexico, but all the while it was he who was being pursued. Cushing had about 20 soldiers with him as they crossed back into Arizona from Mexico, but the entire time, everywhere he went, the grass had been burned or was then currently burning. The Apaches also burned signal fires all night, all around Cushing and his men. And these fires kept these men up all night, worried. The Apaches were led by Joh and Geronimo. They were toying with the hardened commander. After a few days, the horses, the army's horses, they were hungry. There was no grass. They had all been burned, remember? The men were on edge. The Apache were following. Joh and Geronimo were relatives by way of marriage, and the two were inseparable friends. They were seeking vengeance for Cushing's raids, specifically, and Mexican raids as well, and just generally every other depredation that had been done to their family and their friends. Joh was a Netni Apache, and they were characterized by even other Apaches as being outlaws. One Badonkahi cousin called them, quote, outlaws recruited from other bands, and included in their membership a few Navajos as well as Mexicans and whites who had been captured while children. End quote. Geronimo, the infamous Badonkahi warrior, who had lost his family to a raid in Mexico, if you'll remember, he didn't care about such things when it came to his brother-in-arms, Joh. He didn't care that he was a Nehetni. And on this day in May of 1871, absolutely none of that mattered, not a single bit, as Joh and Geronimo laid a perfect trap for Cushing and his men to ride directly into. The Apaches lured Cushing into a canyon. They were using fresh tracks of an Apache woman. Taking the bait, Cushing sent 3 scouts into the steep canyon, as the rest of the men followed. Eventually, though, the leader of the scouts, Sergeant John Mott, he knew the score. He realized he was leading his men to death. So the sergeant and his men began ascending the walls of the steep canyon to escape the trap, but it was too late. 15 Apaches sprang and began firing. The men were holed up. Essentially, were just waiting for death, waiting for a bullet. One of them got their hat stolen by a mounted Apache as the battle commenced, as it was raging. I mean, these Apaches, they had some nerves. Cushing, continuing to take the bait, came to the rescue, with his men firing at the hidden Apaches as much as they could. Sergeant Mott begged Cushing to get everyone the heck out of there, but Cushing decided to charge. He was not a man to back away. These white eyes only made it 20 yards before one of the men took a bullet to the face. No sooner had his corpse hit the ground than did the Apache charge. Mott rode to the scene afterwards and said, quote, "It seemed as if every rock and bush became an Indian." End quote. In the ensuing charge, Cushing was shot in the chest, at which point he screamed at Mott, quote, Sergeant, I am killed! Take me out! Take me out!" End quote. Mott and another man rushed to Cushing and began dragging him to safety, but after about 10 steps, Cushing took another bullet, but this one was to the face. Sergeant Mott and the man dropped Cushing's body and retreated to the nearby Babokamari River. 2 more Americans would die that day. Or rather, 1 American and 1 Englishman. The survivors of the ambush rode all night to camp to warn the others. By the time a retaliatory strike had been rallied, Geronimo and Joh, along with their surviving warriors, they were long gone. They were deep down in the Sierra Madre Mountains of Mexico. Lieutenant Burke, who had to bury the bodies, he said of the Apache after the infamous attack, quote, "The Apache was in no sense a coward." End quote. Cushing, the most capable Indian fighter and the highest-ranking American military officer the Apaches would kill for the entirety of the Apache Wars, Cushing had made it his personal mission to find and kill Cochise. But in the end, he was killed by Geronimo and Joh. Joh is the father of Dakluji, one of the narrators of Eve Ball's Inda, which I am reading for subscribers. Dakluji talks about how his father had made it his life's mission to kill Cushing. From the time of Cushing's death until about the 1960s, it was actually believed that Cochise had been the one that killed Cushing. But we now know it was Joh. Joh and his unending hatred for the lieutenant, who had caused so much death amongst his Apaches. Not all Apache were wanting to continue the fight, though. In 1871 at Fort Grant, a group of Apache women would approach the gates waving an improvised white flag, and they would ask to be able to speak to the fort's commander. At this time, Fort Grant's commander was a man named Lieutenant Royal Whitman. He obliged the ladies who were looking for a lost child that they thought the Americans had taken after a raid. I read both that either no child could be found, or that the child had been found but he didn't want to go to the mountains with the older women and he wanted to stay there. I'm not sure which is true. Either way, before the women left without the child, they asked Whitman if their chief could come by and speak to Lieutenant as well. Whitman said that would be fine. Days later, the Apache leader that the women were talking about, Esquiminzin, the chief who briefly owned the captured boy Felix, he met with Whitman and said, "Look, my people are tired. We want to be done with this war." In reality, they were tired, and they were hungry, and they were scared of the Americans. Esquiminzin, he then asked if he could settle in Aravaipa Canyon near this Fort Grant. But Whitman had no power to grant that, since this clashed with Grant's new peace policy, which forbade having localized treaties and deals. Whitman was in a bind. He was unsure. So he told Esquiminzin, "Give me a couple days. Let me figure this out. Let me send word to my superiors." And then he sent off a dispatch. 6 weeks later, instead of getting an answer, Whitman got a rebuke from headquarters saying he did not follow proper procedure by attaching a summary of his report that he gave. He didn't attach a summary of the report to the outside of the envelope, so it didn't get open. It didn't get read. You gotta love bureaucracy. Whitman said to heck with this, and he decided he would house these 150 or so Apaches under Escamizin. He would house them right next to the fort in a place that became known as Camp Grant. He decided he could do this because he called these Apaches prisoners of war. Although Whitman did not disarm these Apache prisoners of war, he actually was under the impression that these Apaches' weapons were of poor quality, so he didn't even bother. But the Apaches, they were smart, and they didn't bring their best weapons up to the fort, up to the camp. They hid their best weapons in the mountains surrounding Fort and Camp Grant. Whitman also allowed these prisoners of war to carry said weapons when hunting and guarding their women while they were gathering. So much for prisoners of war. And Camp Grant, not to be confused with Fort, they were next to each other. Camp Grant wasn't like the other reservations in other ways either. Whitman, who seems to be quite intelligent and industrious, if not somewhat naive, he instituted a ration policy and a work program, and that work program gave Apache workers tickets, which they could use to redeem for more food and goods. He even worked with local ranchers around the area to have the Apache harvest some of their crops and hay for them, and for pay. Eventually, this led to the camp's numbers increasing from 150 to 500 Apaches. As the numbers grew, so did the trust between Whitman and these Apaches. I mean, it had to. Whitman, after all, was acting outside of his orders. If anything went wrong, it would be his head. Therefore, he spent a considerable amount of time within the camp. He also apparently checked the camp every 3 to 5 days to make sure no one was escaping. And he truly came to trust Escamizin. Even Whitman's second-in-command, W. Robinson, said, quote, "I was strongly opposed to the peace policy with these Indians when they first came in, and was not convinced of their sincerity until I evidenced by watching their actions carefully." End quote. Watching them carefully, though, that became tougher when Whitman allowed the camp to move 5 miles upstream towards the spring where the water came from. It was true that the Indians were planting corn and seemingly more peaceful. Had Whitman stumbled upon the correct plan for the Apache? Of course, how many times had this happened before? How many times have I already talked about how one particular band of Apaches wanted to come in and be peaceful, only for them to turn around as soon as a ration is withheld or a crime is committed against them, or they just got bored and left. In 1859, the U.S. Army, they began to make treaties with certain bands, only for them to abandon the terms and commit to raiding once again. The Spanish had dealt with that for hundreds of years. This, what I just said, is how the settlers felt, the Anglo and Mexican. This is what they assumed would happen, that the Apache would go back on their word. The settlers saw through what they perceived as a ruse, and they weren't willing to become victims of a fake peace they knew would soon be broken. Not to mention, as Hutton puts it, quote, "Nearly every citizen of Tucson had lost property, a friend, or a relative to the Apache." End quote. In March of 1871, while the number of Apaches was growing at Camp Grant, the number of concerned citizens was growing as well. And in that month, the citizens sent a delegate to meet personally with the ineffective Colonel Stoneman, who was visiting from his palace lair in Los Angeles. The chairman of the delegation known as the Committee of Public Safety, was a man named William Ury. Ury was, well, he actually had an incredible history, an incredible story. The man was born in Virginia in 1817, but he eventually made it out to Texas. And this was when Texas was still controlled by the Mexicans. And then, I kid you not, he was at the Alamo while it was surrounded by Santa Anna's forces. But he was sent in the middle of the night to escape with a message for Sam Houston, a message that said, "Please send reinforcements." William Ury was one of the last Americans to escape that disaster alive. He would then go on and participate in another Texas disaster in 1842. And this one became known as the Muir Expedition. Ury and 300 other Texans, they rode deep into Mexico, only to be caught. And each and every one of them was sentenced to death. Until that got changed to decimation. That's the old Roman legionnaire punishment, where only 1 out of every 10 would die instead of all 10. To facilitate this choosing, the Mexicans filled a jar with white and black beans. White bean meant you live, black bean meant you die. Frederick Remington in 1896 actually painted this scene, and it's really awesome. He called the painting The Drawing of the Black Bean. Everyone should check it out. I'll put it on the site. But also, in the incredible novel by Cormac McCarthy, the greatest American novel written yet, Blood Meridian, one of the characters, a real-life man named Bigfoot Wallace, he is mentioned. McCarthy writes, "At night he'd tell them of his years in the West, an amiable warrior, a reticent man. He'd been at Muir, where they fought until the gutters ran with blood by the gallon." End quote. Ury would survive the Alamo, and then he would survive this decimation, only to be marched down to Mexico City to prison. But eventually, he'd be released, and then he would come back to Texas, and he would join the Texas Rangers. And then, once the Mexican-American War broke out, the man joined the fight and fought with future President General Zachary Taylor. It seems this man clearly had some beef with the Mexicans. I mean, he sure did like fighting against them. But, after the war, Ury moved to Durango, where he married a 19-year-old Mexican woman named Inez Garcia. And then the two headed to California for the gold rush. And then, after that, he and his wife moved from California to Tucson in 1856, where he got a job for the ill-fated Overland Mail Company. Shortly after his move to Tucson, his brother joined him, and they had an extremely profitable dairy farm all the way out in southern Arizona. But when the Civil War broke out, the two Virginians obviously sided with their home state and became ardent Confederates. That is, until 1862, when the Union governor of Arizona appointed Ury as the first mayor of Tucson. After the war, the dude fought for free public schools in the town and even sat on the school board. He, obviously, was fluent in Spanish, so he was an interpreter. And then by 1870, when his daughter was married in the town of Tucson, the newspaper covered the occasion, and the band from Fort Grant came and played. He was that big a deal. I mean, just listen to his history. That's pretty incredible. So him being the leader of the Committee of Public Safety in 1871, that was a no-brainer. But he was so disgusted by his meeting with Stoneman that he said, quote, "We can expect nothing more from him. If anything further is expected, we must depend upon our own efforts for its consummation." End quote. I'm sorry, though. The Committee of Public Safety just rubs me the wrong way. Too Jacobin Robespierre. Oh, what a horrible man that guy was. He earned that 15 minutes of applause after his beheading, in my opinion. Uri, though, he was a very different man, in a very different place, in a very different time. Although his future actions would also be described by many, especially the Apache, as horrible. At this time in 1871, despite the 500 or so quote-unquote peaceful Apaches at Camp Grant, there were still atrocities and attacks being carried out on the people of Tucson and Tubac. One instance saw a man named Perry Redmond at Fort Apache get a lance through his heart. And then 4 other citizens were killed in the same week by different Apache attacks. And the evidence of these attacks, it consistently pointed towards Camp Grant. I mean, the evidence was inescapable. Footprints in the sand, inescapable. Juan Elias, the prominent vecino that I talked about earlier, he had recently been wounded by an Apache raid that stole his vast herd of cattle. After the raid, he would track the thieves dang near to the gates of Camp Grant. And then the final straw came when 28-year-old Leslie B. Wooster and his woman, wife or girlfriend, not sure, they were brutally murdered at their ranch just outside of Tubac on March 20th. Uri wrote of the impending crashing wave when he said, quote, "The work of death and destruction was kept up with ever-increasing force until the slaughter of Wooster and wife and the Santa Cruz above Tubac so inflamed the people that an indignation meeting was held in Tucson. And it was determined to raise a military company at once." End quote. Unfortunately for the Apache at Camp Grant, the people of Tubac and Tucson decided they needed to punish someone for this murder, all of these murders, despite the Wooster one in particular probably not being committed by these particular Apaches led by Esquiminzin. Because turns out that day where the Woosters were murdered, that day at Camp Grant was ration day, and there were even more Indians at the fort than were normally. The citizens of the committee did not know this, though, and justice in their eyes must be served. 84 Americans would sign up to be on the raid with Uri and the Committee of Public Safety. Almost 100 Mexican vecinos would also sign up. But just as important as the vecinos and the pledged Americans were another group who had been at war with the Apache for 200 years or more. The O'odham. So Uri and the Elias brothers, they went down south and met with the O'odham's leader, a man named Chief Francisco Galarrita. This Indian warrior man, who was also an agricultural Christian, he needed no convincing. He was in. So were the nearby O'odham of Coyote Sitting's band. The two promised the committee 100 warriors. On April 28th, the date when this military company of civilians, that did not in fact have military backing, but on April 28th, Uri, the Elias brothers of Juan y Jesus, 6 other Americans, and quite a few Mexican vecinos with O'odham warriors, they all met at the meeting spot in preparation for their assault on Camp Grant. And yes, you heard that right. 6 of the over 80 Americans that pledged to be there actually arrived. Uri would tell the Elias brothers, quote, "The valor of all these plumed knights seemed to have oozed out of their finger ends." End quote. They lost their strength the moment they signed the pledge. One American who came through with his pledge was local merchant Sam Hughes, who provided brand new sharps, carbines, and a whole bunch of ammo. Once at the meeting spot known as Tanque Verde, the men held a quorum in Spanish, and this quorum elected Jesus Elias as their leader. Then, the party of 92 O'odhams, 48 Vecinos, and 6 Americans, so 146 men in total, they all commenced a 2-day journey towards Camp Grant, where righteous and horrendous violence was planned, and ultimately executed. The group traveled only at night, so as not to alert the Apache or the army. Once at Esquiminzin's Rancheria, 5 miles up the canyon, known as Camp Grant, the Mexican Vecinos went in from the south, while the O'odham and Americans surrounded the camp from the north. To the east and west were steep canyon walls. The Apache's only sentries that night were an older man and an older woman, and they were playing cards when the O'odham warriors, with their thick ironwood clubs, beat them to death. No alarm was raised. The massacre had begun. And I'm going to let Hutton describe the horrendous scene. Quote, "The slaughter commenced. The Papagos moved so quietly that most of the Apache victims died in their sleep from the blows of wooden war clubs. The barking of dogs and the cries of captive children awakened the village just as the sky began to brighten. But the canyon walls kept the village in darkness as the slaughter intensified. Soon, the nightmarish scene was lit by the burning wickiups, casting bizarre shadows against the canyon walls. Some people scrambled up the rocks but were shot down by the Hispanics waiting in ambush." End quote. It had to have been an awful, a loud, and a horrifying scene. Well, we know it was a nightmarish because Whitman, the commander of the fort, would later testify about what he came upon after the massacre. He said, quote, "The work had been too thoroughly done." He later said, quote, "I saw the dead bodies of several women that I recognized. 2 were lying on their backs entirely naked and shot through the breast, apparently with pistol balls. I saw the dead bodies of children, perhaps 6. They had died, apparently by gunshot wounds. I recollect one child, perhaps 2 years of age, with the arm nearly cut off. Besides an old man, the only other dead body of a male was a boy, perhaps 16 years of age." End quote. During the raid, Esquiminzin was able to flee with his family. He ran across Aravaipa Creek with his 2-year-old daughter in his arms. But as he ran, he got separated from his 2 wives and their 5 other children. All 7 of them would be killed by O'odham Papago war clubs. 125 Apaches were massacred that day, and 29 children were taken captive as slaves for the O'odham. All of the 125 had been women and children except for 8. Only 8 men were killed by the Committee of Public Safety. William Ory, the head of the committee, who was known locally as Uncle Billy, he would later state that, quote, "By 8 o'clock, our tired troops were resting and breakfasting on the San Pedro, a few miles above the post, in full satisfaction of a work well done." End quote. The murder of those hostages in camp was an act of war against the United States. Quote from the ineffectual military commander, Colonel Stoneman. President Grant, probably none too pleased that this happened at a camp named after himself, called the massacre, quote-unquote, pure murder. He then called for arrests and an investigation. He pretty much told the Arizona Territorial Governor, who was indeed on Uncle Baby Billy's and the Elias's side, Grant ordered the governor to arrest the perpetrators or risk martial law. Grant also fired Colonel Stoneman. The president meant business. Heads would roll. The trial that began after the massacre, the trial held in the same building where the massacre was planned, the trial was the first time in Arizona territorial history that a non-Apache was prosecuted for the killing of an Apache. Jacoby talks a little more about this trial and how it had some other odd parts to it. He wrote, quote, "Rather than determine the individual guilt or innocence of each subject, it was agreed to try only Sidney DeLong, an alleged member of the attacking party and the mayor of Tucson, and let whatever judgment he received be applied to the rest of the defendants. Why DeLong, who played only a marginal role in the Camp Grant massacre, became the lead figure in the prosecution is not entirely clear, but it may have been because of his prominent position in Tucson's local government." End quote. The trial was held inside the old Spanish Presidio in Tucson, and in attendance would be Anglos, Mexicans, and a whole lot of O'odham. The trial pretty much attempted to connect the Apache to the many recent murders and depredations done against the Mexican vecinos and American Anglos, and also the O'odham. The Apache weren't there to defend themselves, since they were still hiding in the mountains in the hopes that they wouldn't get yet another massacre perpetrated against them. The judge, he eventually dismissed any charges against the O'odham, saying that they and the Apache, they have their own code of conduct in war, and, quote, "By the barbarous codes of both nations, the slaughter of their enemies, of all ages and sexes, is justifiable." End quote. The judge then gave a lengthy speech before dismissing the jurors to go reach a verdict. He would say, quote, "The government of the United States owes its Papago, Mexican, and American residents in Arizona protection from Apache spoliation and assault. If such spoliation and assault are persistently carried on and not prevented by the government, then the sufferers have a right to protect themselves and to employ force enough for the purpose. It is also to be added that if the Apache Nation or any part of it persists in assailing the Papagos or American or Mexican residents of Arizona, then it forfeits the right of protection from the United States." End quote. What are the odds that this speech impacted the jurors, I wonder? Probably pretty high. It only took the jury 19 minutes to declare a verdict of not guilty for the Committee of Public Safety. Despite what happened to his people at the Camp Grant massacre, Esquiminzin convinced what few survivors there were, as well as a whole nother band of Pinal Apaches, he convinced them all to come back to Camp Grant. Whitman had recently promised more protection, especially from a unit of military men from the north. But on their way, on Esquiminzin's and the Pinal Apache's way to the camp, after being in hiding, on their way back to the camp, the patrol of soldiers that was sent to help with the protection of the camp, those soldiers opened fire on Esquiminzin and his friends, and in the confusion, they killed yet another of Esquiminzin's warriors. At Fort Grant, Esquiminzin railed against Whitman. He tore into him. He yelled at him for his utter and complete failure to keep his people, Esquiminzin's Apache people, alive and safe. He said with his trademark stutter, the stutter that Escamizin is famous for, he said, quote, "I have tried, and my people have tried, but the peace you have promised to the Aravaipa has been broken. Not once, but 2 times. Both times it was the Americans who broke the peace. The first one who breaks the peace is the one to blame." End quote. After Escamizin stormed out of the fort, he rode his horse over to a nearby friend's ranch, an American friend's ranch. This friend was the 35-year-old Irishman named Charles McKinney. Since McKinney lived so close to the camp, he had become friends with many of the Apache and had even hired on a bunch of them to work in his fields. Charles, upon seeing his Apache friend, he invited him in for dinner. Afterwards, the two honestly good buddies, they sat on the porch, as all good friends do, and they smoked tobacco while they worried about the current troubles involving the Apache and the White Eyes. Once the last of the tobacco had been smoked, Escamizin stood up, thanked Charles McKinney, shook his hand, and with his other, put his revolver against the Irishman's face before pulling the trigger at point blank. Escamizin said of the brutal murder, quote, "I did it to teach my people that there must be no friendship between them and the white man. Anyone can kill an enemy, but it takes a strong man to kill a friend." In the next episode, I will continue to cover the long saga of the Apache as I go deeper into depth over Cochise, Geronimo, Victorio, Mickey Free, the Navajo scouts that were used against the Apache, and so much more. Thank y'all, and I'll see you again soon in the American Southwest. If you are not already a subscriber but want to be, head on over to the website, theamericansouthwest.com, or my Substack and sign up to be a Roadrunner. There are lots of exclusive episodes and goodies that'll come your way. Not to mention, you're keeping this podcast alive.